Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Jordan Tenenbaum, the host of the Technology Leadership Podcast. We are joined by Jayden Ziegler, the Vice President of Product at Alembic Technologies, and my fantastic co-host, Mark Simon, who's the VP of Strategy over here at Celigo. Today we have a new fantastic episode, and like we said, we're featuring Jayden Ziegler. He works at a company called Alembic, and let's jump right into it. To start, Jayden, I have a quick question. You
Sure.
have a very interesting LinkedIn history. I was doing a little lurking or research, as some call it. And when I say interesting, I mean it's incredibly impressive. And the reason that I say that is you worked at both Apple, Google, and now Alembic, and you had quite a bit to do with AI. And I think AI is like a super hot topic now. People are obsessed with ChatGPT. People are obsessed with like creating weird art, like using robots to do it for you. And my first thought was you were kind of ahead of the game, and seems like you even did some AI technology related learning in college. And I guess like what prompted that? Like, how did you get started on that path? Because you were definitely a leader in that.
Well, I appreciate the flattery there. But first of all, very happy to be here. Really excited to talk about technology with both of y'all. Um, that's a really good question. So I didn't realize I was ahead of the game, I guess, but just taking a little bit of a step back, my background is actually in psychology. So I got a PhD in psychology, and then along the way, I think as you know, I'm basically interested in kind of what's going on in here, right? While we're understanding the world, and artificial intelligence is a really important tool for modeling how we do that, or at least creating hypotheses for how human cognition might work. And so I guess the two kind of just felt like they went hand in hand for me. And so as I was going throughout my PhD, I was just learning more and more about machine learning and artificial intelligence, and ultimately trying to figure out ways that we can, again, leverage those tools to understand more about the brain. But I think it goes in both directions as well, right? So like now that I've transitioned into the technology sphere, it's actually really valuable being able to apply the psychology knowledge that I've learned from my PhD toward developing systems that we are trying to make intelligent and that people have to ultimately interact with and ultimately trust in terms of the information that they're given. And so I guess that was just a long-winded way of saying that I guess my interest stems from just a deep understanding of how people work and using technology to as a tool to understand that.
Awesome. That's super interesting. It's not to. I wonder how many people go from psychology to artificial intelligence. I totally see the connection, but that's like a super unique path to get there. And I guess the second question I had is okay. So you're deep in this field. You're working at fantastic companies like Google, like Apple. I guess what transition? That's the wrong word. What kind of encouraged you to transition to a company like Alembic? Can you tell us, after you tell us that, just kind of what you have going on at Alembic and what you guys do?
I'll start backward. I'll start in the beginning and then work backward. I guess at the end and work backward. So Alembic is a marketing analytics SaaS platform. So we are essentially trying to solve the attribution problem in marketing. And basically what that means is, I've got a conversion, I've got a sale. Where did that come from in the upper part of the funnel? And so this is actually a pretty challenging thing to solve in the space, partly because nowadays marketers have so many tools available to them, right? They've got their social tools, they've got their analytics tools, they've got their data living in all sorts of different places. And then especially with the advent of like Apple tracking, you know, basically cramping down on the ability to track folks across these different touch points, it's become increasingly challenging to make those connections. And so we are ultimately trying to solve that problem at scale to be able to use aggregate data to track where users are coming from all the way down the funnel, to be able to get that attribution data so that at the end of the day, you can understand what's working about your marketing stack, what's not working about your marketing stack, and then for specifically what's not working, how can what insight can you glean from that you can understand whether to cut it or to change something to make it work. So that's my little pitch for Alembic. Honestly, I never thought that I would end up in marketing, and I don't have a background in marketing. I don't really have any predilections toward marketing. So I sort of I fell into Alembic kind of serendipitously. My roommate actually worked at Alembic before I did. And eventually, as a company starts growing, they needed someone to come in, an experienced product leader. And prior to that, it was the CEO doing most of the product work. But honestly, I think ultimately, obviously that personal connection was really important there. But I think the thing that ultimately got me here was, I'd started my career at Apple. I had launched some pretty amazing technology in the translation space there. And then at that point, I kind of was ready for trying what another big company might look and feel like. And so my switch to Google was mostly one of, testing a hypothesis, how different can it be? I was really excited to work on search personalization there for a short stint in time. And I was I was looking forward to continue that work. But what I realized is that at these big companies, especially if you're kind of like middle of the road, middle upper of the road, there's still a lot of challenge in actually making, tangible impact, right? So, there's, I call it institutional sludge effectively, right? So you need to get 20, 30 different sign-offs to make one small change. And from where I was, from where I was standing, not that there's, I mean, I'm not trying to like inherently value that kind of a system. There are reasons that these systems come into place. But for where I was in my career journey, I felt like I wanted a little bit more accountability and a little bit more ownership over the work that I was doing. And this opportunity came into my lap to work with at Alembic, partly brokered through my roommate. And at the time, it just felt right because, now I'd been at a couple of big companies. I kind of knew how that side of things worked. And I was really ready to jump in and have, immediate, more tangible impact and, try on a bunch of different hats and learn the startup world in a way that, I had never quite experienced prior.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I don't know if you get much more immediate impact than being a product leader at an early stage startup. You really don't. I mean, that's as close to it as you get. I mean, that's getting into the into the fire. So that's awesome.
It sure is. I mean, I don't think I knew fully what I was getting myself into, and in retrospect, I think I'm very happy where I am. But it was a shock at first in a lot of ways.
With working at a early stage startup like that early it's interesting. Every company there's challenges that you work at, but the small and large, but yeah, there's just some really interesting things that go on when you have that much autonomy and that much responsibility and that much of a hand in the product or in my example, the social media side of things. And when you're fully responsible for all of that, can be a little overwhelming. But I think clearly, based on this recent promotion, congratulations again. Think you're doing everything right. Sorry, it looked like you were going to say something, Mark. Didn't want to cut you off.
Jordan, I'd love to ask Jayden. I want to make sure that I really understand what Alembic's doing and how it fits in, because it's so intriguing and it's also really timely, right? Everything, the pop culture awareness of AI is just like skyrocketed. And so I think it's really interesting. And a lot of people, I think, sometimes struggle to understand how it applies to business, and particularly like to mid-sized businesses that we see a lot of. So I kind of want to start, make sure I really understand like the business problem you're solving. And so, what I heard was from the way you described it there is solving that attribution problem. And I'm no marketer, but I certainly work closely. I've worked closely with a lot of marketing teams in my career. And one of the things I've seen traditionally has been, right, you have branding efforts. You have this sort of brand side of marketing that lives over here in one part of the world. And that tends to be pretty fuzzy and hard to measure. And often, depending on the organization, like resistance to any attempt to measure. Say, oh, it can't be measured. And it leads to a lot of feel good activities. And some of them clearly have impact and sometimes massive impact, but hard to tangibly put metrics around those and really identify. And then on the other side, you have what I think of really what's grown out of the last like 15, 20 years, the digital marketing channels, which are like very, very measurable. And often those teams, often they evolve into two different marketing teams within marketing. One that's very, very metrics driven, one that has a lot of, it's analytics driven. You have people coming into that from development backgrounds, statistical backgrounds, data scientists. And so you have this one lane that's all about very tight attribution linked together, attribution models and measurement down to, okay, what is the return on investment of this campaign? And you have this other part of the marketing where you have to do often spending massive budgets and can't attribute. And my takeaway was, what I'm hearing is you're trying to solve that problem, essentially, like bring those together and do attribution for those branding events that can't be typically be measured as well.
Yeah, I love this question, actually. So we're, in a nutshell, we're trying to create a common language that marketers of these different types can use to understand their impact. And what I mean by that is, yes, like exactly as you explained it, right? In branding efforts, it really is a lot of times very challenging to measure exactly the impact there, right? Or exactly how much brand you're getting from a particular campaign. And then, to take that a step further, right? Like, you'll spend all of these dollars on brand campaigns, right? And then, your folks over at the digital side or your folks down at the conversion side are like, okay, but so what, right? Like, why did we spend all that money? Did it get us any conversions? Like everyone has their own particular goal or their own particular KPI that they're kind of, pegging down to. And so it's often challenging for them to see the impact of different types of campaigns for these different types of goals. And so we're doing a couple of things to try to solve this. So for one, we are trying to make sense of the unstructured data out there in ways that hasn't really been tried to get wrangled before. So what I mean by that is, right, you've got TV spots, for instance, right? If I buy a TV ad, it's actually, for one, it's really hard to get that data. So there are very few TV providers that have, information about when something airs and how many people see it. And so we actually have a contract with a proprietary data source to be able to pull that data in, which is one way of measuring that kind of brand impact. And then, we combine that with some other proprietary data sources in terms of the news or the PR that you're getting online in web articles. And then, of course, you've got the whole digital side of things in terms of like tracking for your analytics platforms, your social platforms. And so we're trying to we're trying to make sense of all of that unstructured data, which is actually a huge thing that we're throwing AI at, right? Because it's really challenging to make sense of that type of data. And so we're trying to like distill it down into these insights of, like if I did X, did that actually drive eyeballs, right, on some kind of campaign? So point one is that we're just trying to make sense of the full scope of data out there. And I think a lot of companies up until this point, or in general, a lot of companies are really good at maybe one or two channels and being able to kind of track the attribution in those channels. And especially if you're working within the digital space, it's a lot easier to trace the breadcrumbs there. So we're pulling in a lot of unstructured data streams that haven't been wrangled as well before and are trying to make sense of that and then, track those breadcrumbs to the other digital channels that you see. So that's point one to, I guess, to answer your question. And then the other thing that we're doing actually, which speaks a little bit more to what I almost talk about as like the politics of an organization is that, again, the different teams will have their different KPIs that they're measuring down to. And so we actually created this framework recently. We call it the Action Attention Framework. I'm happy to get into in more detail, but it's a way of actually being able to effectively capture, it's effectively measuring the same end goal, but across different marketing goals. And so what I mean by that is, if I'm the brand team, I can pop into Alembic and I can see, we've created our own proprietary algorithms based on all the data that we're pulling in. We've created a way to measure the impact on exactly that brand from that unstructured data. And so if I'm the brand team, I can pop into Alembic and I can set my goal as I'm tracking brand, what was the impact that these marketing activities had on brand? And then, as the demand gen team, I can pop in and I can say, hey, I actually am going to set mine to demand, and now I can see the exact marketing impact on demand. And by the way, these two, ways of tracking are actually underlain by the exact same algorithms. And so they're actually very comparable. At the end of the day, if you're looking at your brand metrics and your demand metrics, you can actually kind of trade them off and see, was this thing better at building brand? Was it better at building demand, or did it jointly build both of them? And so we're trying to enable this framework, this way of different teams within the organization to both talk to each other about their KPIs and see how the campaigns that are being played out are actually impacting all of them jointly, and potentially, all successfully, maybe some less successful than others, but recognizing that, there are different things that these different teams are doubling down on, and that all of them are important given the right context.
That makes a lot of sense. And I chuckle a little bit to myself, because I've been in some very, I'll call them lively discussions lately internally about just this. How do we measure brand? And being like, well, how can we really measure brand? What's the right metric? Do we track 1, 2, 3, 5 metrics? Looking out, and this fed into our planning for this year. It was like, well, we at a company, Soligo, we had an objective to change our brand awareness in the mid-market. But it was like, well, how do we measure that? And is it 1? Is it 2? Do we need, and we even talked about, do we come up with a brand score? Do we take a bunch of these things and put them together? And anything that a mid-market company we would do on our own is going to be much less sophisticated than something that's purpose-built. And it sounds like that really is something that you put a lot of thought into, how to make a sophisticated representation of that. And that it's really interesting, because I know, at least at just dipping our toe in that, how hard that is for a company. And it's like, well, and then you pick something, and well, is that the right thing? Is it not? How do you measure some of these things? It's a very timely question. It really resonates as the challenge that companies face in trying to figure this out, because, going through it.
Hey, Jayden, congrats on your easiest customer ever.
Happy to take another meeting.
Yeah, I'll take a little bit of commission there.
Well, and you're right. I mean, and so I think the beauty of being at such an early stage in this game is that we're figuring it out as we go too, right? So we are trying to create these kind of common scores to measure brand, right? And like, we're not going to get it right first pass. I think, we've got a robust framework right now that seems to be working very well, and we've run it by a number of our customers and have validated it by a number of them, and it kind of makes sense internally, and it's sanity checked. But there's always a lot of room for improvement, right? So I'm sure, as we get access to more and more streams of data, or, understand a little bit more differently about how some of these things are being affected, we can certainly tweak on that particular way of doing things. But, we're trying to create somewhat of an industry standard by doing this, but there will always be an ability for folks to then, customize certain aspects of it as well. But I think what we gain from that kind of industry standard approach too, is that as we have customers in all of these different pillars, then internally, like, let's say you're the financial services pillar, right? We've got a new customer coming on board. And like, at the end of the day, we could also tell you, how do you stack up against the other portfolio of companies that we have who are using this exact same metric? And, it kind of gives you that little like microcosm understanding of where you fall in the grand scheme of things. And that's eventually, ultimately what a lot of these companies are trying to get anyway. And so I think it's just really exciting to be in this space and to be able to experiment with these ideas, and talk to, folks like you who are very much facing the same challenges, and seeing how together we can come up with solutions that work for everyone.
No, Jayden, I think I 100% agree with that. And so this is, I mentioned earlier how timely this is, right? There's a lot of thought being thrown around and talk about AI. And I'd love to actually establish some baselines, because when I think, personally, I've always kind of I started out as a technologist, and then I moved more to the business side, and think of myself as sort of a bridge in solving business problems between between the technology side and the business. But I talk to a lot of business leaders they're true business leaders, and they're very interested in technology and being modern. But when they hear certain things, they don't know what some of these terms mean. And I'd love to ask you about a couple of these that you brought up so far, because I think it'd be really helpful for business leaders to understand. And one that you mentioned was you used the word unstructured data. sort of. So anyone that's been, sort of elbows deep in the gut trying to get a querying data or define a metric for something, you just kind of, you've been through the pain of dealing with that, so at an intrinsic level. But for someone that hasn't, what does that really mean?
So what's a good way to describe this? So maybe the best way to describe that is as a contrast to what structured data is, right?
Yeah.
So let's take, Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics, right? When you are tracking your website and you've embedded, these touch points on every page to see, when someone clicks on, add to cart or checks out or something, right? What Adobe is doing is that's, it's firing off an event, which is going to log this bit of data, right? And it's logging it in such a way that, like, even if, no matter what the source of that data, it's always in a similar format, right? So, you've got, one label that identifies what the thing is. You've got a label that identifies what the value is, right? And it's very much like this kind of tabular, like, plug and play. I know exactly what this field means. I know exactly what this field means. To heck with whatever input data I put in, I can always make sense of it, right? And so if I create a script to run on top of that to analyze it, it's going to work no matter what that input data is, right? And so that's the happy path, right? And that's ultimately what we would love all of our data to look like. And there's a lot of engineering that goes into making data work that way, right? And the data scientists out there have, like, some of the hardest jobs because they oftentimes have to wrangle data to make it in formats that the rest of us can actually use it. And effectively, that's what Alembic is trying to do with some of the marketing data out there that isn't beautifully formatted. And so the unstructured data is what I'm saying is, like, anything that basically isn't that, right? So you've got, you're pulling data from television, right? Like, there's no common format for how, if I mention Saligo on my commercial ad, right, there's no common format for pulling that data down and putting it into some kind of tabular structure that then I can run, an algorithm on or summary statistics on to make sense of it, like lickety split, right? And so that's unstructured data. It's very much messy. It's not in a common format. And we're trying to build those common formats, or at the very least, make sense of the insanity there that then, allows us to put it in an easily understandable way that we can then compare it to the other well-structured things out there and then really see those cross-pollination efforts.
Mark, hold on one sec, because I know you have some other terms that you want to ask, and I'm just curious. Maybe both of you could answer this. If companies or enterprises or industries as big as television, something that is ubiquitous with nearly every home in America, why are they not creating formats of organizing the data and selling it to you in a nice, clean, package, structured way, rather than forcing, like, companies to be created that have to do that to repurpose it to sell to other people? Like, is there a reason that they're not monetizing that data? Data monetization seems like the thing that everybody's so interested in and has such a stake in. Like, is television just so far behind? They're stuck in, like, the 1940s. Hello, here, what? And they talk like that, or like, what's going on there? And then, sorry, then we can get back to the terms. I just wanted to ask that before I forgot.
I mean, I'll take a stab. I don't fully think that I know the answers here, but I think one is, like, television is not a one thing, right? So, you've got your broadcast networks that are, putting the content out, but there are actually there are dozens, hundreds of different individual broadcast networks throughout the country, and they might have their own individualized way of doing things, right? And so there's no one monolithic TV entity for one. Which I think is the problem here, because then, if I'm someone trying to scrape all of the broadcast information across all of these different broadcast networks, it's going to look different from broadcast network A than it is from B, from C, from D. And there are, to their credit, there are companies out there that are aggregating that data, and we partner with one of them to get the data. But even still, part of the challenge that they're facing is just, like, getting it such that you can then pull that data in a so that you can at least write the queries in a similar way to pull the data across these different structures. But they're often, solving such a large challenge that, like, the flip side of that, then the actually analyzing it or, like, making sense of it is, left to the folks who are trying to ingest that data. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. And, certainly we're going to try to solve one aspect of it that works for us. But I don't think I don't think that, I think that the fragmentation is exactly what causes the problem and the challenge there. But I'd love to hear if Mark has additional thoughts.
Yeah, I kind of look at it from a broader industry perspective across multiple industries. And what I've seen is that you have these traditional industries evolving and developing. If you think of TV, that most likely came out of radio, right? And so you have this industry evolve in a direction, and while it's not a technology-led industry, they're not necessarily thinking about data in that way and how to create a value add. And so this always creates opportunity for disruption. And so you often see some industries will evolve more quickly in a particular direction to be more data friendly, because they're adding, as someone along the way decided to provide a value add service to their customers, i.e. their advertisers, by saying, hey, we can disrupt this industry because we're going to provide data in a different way, and be more technically oriented. And so then those industries will then evolve, and the competitors will realize that they need to pick that up. But you see whole lines of industries being slower behind the curve. Like in the past, I've worked with professional sports teams who have, over the last 20 years, have become much more technically oriented. And one of the products that I worked on that we built for sports teams was consolidating the ad data that their advertisers, that they would a quote partner, they would refer to them, might buy an advertising package for the whole season, which could be everything from naming rights to the stadium to a billboard to in-person appearances, and it's across multiple things. And trying to quantify that was actually providing that data in a more digestible format for a CMO or a CEO of their advertisers, what they call their partners, to consume. Worked with a sports team that they decided that was a competitive advantage and partnered with us to build this and then create a product to resell it. And that was no one had tried. It was all manually done PowerPoints. And that's just one example I see that's related to this. And so, that happens in a lot of industries. So I would, at a certain point, we would expect, like in TV, that they're going to say, hey, there's a way to disrupt this and provide, and someone's going to lead out and start to create a standard. But there's such varying technology adoption across industry that you just have some that just haven't gotten there yet, Jordan. And I think that's really what it is when we look at TV, for example, and across a lot of others.
So do we just start a new company, or what's the deal?
Maybe we gave somebody an idea.
Hey, we're copyrighted.
We could all benefit from it if someone builds it, for sure.
Fair. Okay, so Mark, thank you for letting me interrupt. But you started with unstructured data. Were there some other terms that you
well, and the other one, the other one that I just wanted to ask is the one that's on the right. It's what does AI mean? What does artificial intelligence, machine learning? Everyone is throwing that around, and it's gotten to the point where now I think the majority of people using that term, it's like magic, and they use it in place of magic, and because that's not acceptable way to enter into a conversation. Well, let's just apply some magic over here. Can we use AI for that? And it's and that's, I think, a lot of what, and that this is you spend, right, this is, how do you describe that succinctly? But I think that's really important for a lot of business leaders. Like, what does that really mean? Is that what's happening there when someone says, oh, I'm going to apply AI to solve this problem? How do you describe that answer, Jayden?
That's an excellent question. I think a lot about this, actually. And at its core, what I think AI to be is less the magical, ethereal, like sexiness of it, and more using a system that can create or can effectively approximate some small subset of human intelligence and do it in a way that's more efficient than humans, right? So let's take a case from our own example, right? So, we've been talking about television, and we've been talking about the fact that the data that we're pulling back from that is really unstructured, right? And so it makes it challenging to understand if, the TV spot that was aired over here is using the same language for, like the same language of the advertisement for the TV spot over here, right? So we've got all of these mentions floating around in the ether across a number of different stations. We have no way of tying them together, right? So yeah, as a human, right, I can listen to that or I can read that and I can recognize that that's similar to that. But in one kind of small instance, what we're using AI to do is to sort of automate the process of finding those matches, right? And so that's like that's taking a task that a human could do, and a human intelligent task, and using computers to automate that in a more efficient way. And so that's ultimately what I take AI to be, and certainly it can scale up to be these like much more ethereal things like Chat GPT and the kind of sentience that may or may not be living behind that. But I think a lot of your bread and butter AI technologies are not going to be at least at that level, at least, and certainly haven't been for a while now. And I think a lot of what our companies are thinking about, and a lot of companies in our position are thinking about, is how can we use computers to solve these much smaller scale problems that then like ultimately build toward a much higher level of insight. And there have to be industry disruptors like we're kind of seeing in the space right now. But I personally am not disrupting in that kind of way. And when it comes to application of AI for me, it's much more the immediate needs of how can we make this more efficient? How can we give insights to people in ways that they haven't seen it before?
Yeah, I think that was a great explanation. And the way I often think of it, whether it's when it comes up in conversation over a dinner party or it's in a business setting, I often think of it by way of example in that way. And the one that always comes back to me and from some things that I've worked on in the past, or the way that we use it here at Celigo, is pattern matching. You say, humans are actually very good at identifying patterns and very quick at synthesizing their experience and then identifying a pattern, whether consciously or especially unconsciously. You probably speak to that way better than I'd ever be able to. But that is that's an application that AI does very, very well, is taking some pattern and then scaling it out, doing something that a human could do intuitively, and then breaking that down so it fits a set of rules, and then scaling that out across maybe billions or trillions of data points, and then doing it at a level that you could never have people do. And that for me is an example. And we do that in our product, because we've used OpenAI for a couple years for error management and automation, because it often can just turn in noise. You're moving data around. You guys moved a lot of data around as well. That when it doesn't meet the quote contract, you have all these failures and it just turn into noise. And it's like, well, what are the patterns through the noise? What are the things that actually need to be acted on versus not, or maybe can be just sort of fixed automatically, or things that need action, and applying, again, it's just applying patterns to a big set. And I don't, maybe that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but sometimes it's required to get to a level of, because just calling it magic, I don't think that's sufficient.
I completely think that is an absolutely spot on description of what's going on here, because pattern matching is at the core of any machine learning algorithm. And it's exactly what things like ChatGPT are doing, right? I mean, it's based on an input set of billions and trillions of rows of data, and it's just trying to find patterns so that given an input, I can then predict the next thing that's likeliest to come based on the pattern that I've extracted from the data that I've seen. So it's pattern matching all the way down. I think that's a very elegant way of putting it. And in fact, it does scale up to these higher complex examples very, very nicely.
Yeah, that's pretty spot on, Mark. I used to work at an AI-based company that dealt with supply chain management, and one of the biggest aspects that they always talked about, the account executives over and over, was pattern matching. And when you have billions and billions of data points, especially across manufacturing, now with like IoT, where they're measuring every single little thing from the speed to the temperature to the how many robots flick the button this direction, if there's a pattern that's not matching, that becomes like a point of alert. And so I'm no AI technologist or vice president of engineering or anything, but that's how I understand quite a bit of it. And I'm sure there's a million more aspects of AI beyond pattern management that I'm not touching on, but I think that's a really easy way for folks like me to understand it very quickly. So both of your guys' explanations were fantastic. Thank you for those.
I was really just looking for confirmation that I was thinking about the right way, since we've got the expert here and we've got Jayden pinned down. So
that's perfect. It's definitely not magic, that's for sure. But it is discussed like that frequently. I had a few kind of non-technical, non-product, non-company questions for you, Jayden. Sure. And I say this in almost every interview I've ever been in, and all of the podcasts that I've been on. I like to humanize the other person. Especially vice presidents, to some people can be very intimidating. They're up in this high stratosphere, and they're not a relatable, normal person. And every single one that I've met in interviews and podcasts actually are like, they are real people. They have families and interests and things like that. And so the first question that I want to ask is, do you think there's anything, I'm sorry if this comes out of left field, but like in your childhood that kind of made you want to work in either psychology, technology, AI? Like, did you have any, did you go to the space summer camp and that really jump-started your, I know I went to Lego summer camp. That doesn't have anything to do with social media management, but was there anything that kind of was a catalyst for what you do now?
Great question. I think a lot about this, actually. And so we're going to go a little deep, and I hope it doesn't, hope it's not too deep.
Go. But
yeah, so I think it's interesting because, so I grew up in North Dakota, and I identify as a gay man. And, back at the time when I was growing up in the 90s and the early 2000s, certainly the society was not as accepting. And certainly places like North Dakota, which are a lot more conservative leaning, tend to be very intolerant of things like that. And so honestly, one of the, tracing it back, obviously everything makes sense in retrospect, right? But tracing it back, I think I became first involved in language, and that for me, and so by the way, like my PhD study was primarily in language. And so that's why these like NLP, natural language models, ChatGPT are pretty core, near and dear to my heart. For me, it was basically escapist, right? So like the idea that you could learn another language, learn about another culture, maybe imagine living in another place that's much more accepting, was ultimately the thing that kind of let me latch onto that. And then as I got older and older, and I was, more inherently interested in why people behave the way they do toward other people, and why people, say the kinds of things that they do toward other people and have the kinds of beliefs that they have toward other people, the two kind of melded together into psychology, which then eventually led to technology as a way to use those insights to make our experiences with other people through the technologies that we use better and better. So yeah, I think, ultimately it comes down to that. And I think the perspective that I bring hopefully ends up helping make things better for some other folks. And so I think just the other thing that I would like to say about that is that I very much value representation, right? So like I try to live out and proud as a gay man, because knowing that folks like me exist in these kinds of positions, and that, little Johnny, 7-year-old, can see that that's something attainable someday, and that, being your true self at work is totally possible, then, hopefully that's the kind of impact and the kind of legacy that I want to have on people.
That's awesome, man. I think, a lot of people's work is very internal and not a lot of people see it. And my work is social media management. Literally everyone sees everything that I do. And so I strive to be as inclusive and, care about representation as much as possible. And so I think that you're kind of like living your truth, or whatever saying, you have out there, is really important. And unless people like you are doing what you've done, then people like me won't have the opportunity to share that on a public scale. And then, like you said, little Johnny won't know that that's a possibility. And that's why it's so important, because if you're discriminating or keeping certain people out of certain roles based on whatever minority status they may have, you're kind of just like shooting yourself in the foot. That's something that I always didn't really understand. It's like you're just like not accessing the best talent, because you are some of the best talent. And if someone was to disregard you for who you are, that's dumb on their part, literally. So that got super deep. I'm glad we got to talk about that. And then I'll I have one other question that I like to ask most guests, and Mark, if you have any after that, we can begin to wrap up because I don't want to take up too much of Jayden's time. I know, Jayden, that you said you're a runner, and you've been running every day for the past 7 years. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I have too. If you're listening, I'm being 100% honest. I have never stopped running or exercising. No, I'm just kidding. So obviously you do stuff outside of work, and like I said, I like to humanize folks. Are there any other passions or hobbies or interests that you have that are unique or unusual, or kind of have helped define your experience as a person, like, but specifically outside of work?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great way to dovetail with my previous answer, which is shameless plug. So I'm again, representation, all about it, and so I've become there's this organization called Out in Tech, which is a national organization that provides community events, mentoring, et cetera, for folks who identify as LGBTQ plus. So I am deeply involved in that organization. They have a mentorship program where we pair, up and coming folks who want to get involved in tech, and then, seasoned mentors in tech. And this past spring, I guess, as of January, I stepped into a leadership position leading the admissions team, trying to make those pairings and ultimately make the mentorship program very successful. And so I'd say that, like, outside of maybe running, one of my biggest passions on the side is being able to give back in meaningful ways, and through organizations like Out in Tech. I find that to be really valuable and rewarding, and the kind of thing that, I wish I had when I was growing up. And so I try to give back in those ways. And that's probably the biggest thing taking up a lot of my time these days. And I find a lot of value in it.
That's awesome, man. For those of you listening, if you look up "pay it forward" in the dictionary, you will see a photo of Jayden. Fun fact, page 387. Check it out.
Wow.
Well, yeah, Mark, do you have anything to close with? I want to give you an opportunity before we let everyone get back to their day-to-day.
I mean, I would just say that Jayden's work to make the world a better place is inspiring. So,
to say the least.
definitely.
Well, awesome. For those who made it this far, thank you so much for listening to the Technology Leadership Podcast. Again, I'm Jordan, the social media manager here at Sligo, host of the podcast. Jayden Ziegler, who is the vice president of product at Alembic. You can find them at getalembic.com. And Mark Simon, who is the fantastic vice president of sales over here at Sligo. We thank you for your time, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you so much, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.